Hello, and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer, and I run the Production Advice website aimed at helping you get better results recording, mixing, and mastering your music. And with me again this week is John Tidy from reaperblog.net, who I understand is ill again.
Yes, a separate illness, but it's good to be here. Good to hear you again, Ian. And thank you, listeners, for putting up with my sickness.
I actually can't hear it this week at all. So it's whatever pills you're taking are doing the job.
Yeah, exactly. It was way worse. Anyways.
Good. Okay, well, I'm glad you're feeling mildly alive. So the original title for this episode was going to be MP3, ACC, OGG, ETC, OMG. But John told me that was too gimmicky, so we went with the more straightforward version. But the reason for that is that we are talking about lossy audio data encoding again. And I said that very carefully because I'm going to try and be very careful not to refer to it as lossy compression because of the potential confusion between the different types of compression. There's data compression, crunching numbers to make smaller file sizes for streaming and to go on portable media players. And there's dynamic compression using compressors where you're controlling the loud and soft passages of the audio. And we did a whole episode on that already. That was episode 36. So if all of that sounds confusing because you've just picked this show out of the ether, then head back and maybe listen to that one first, because if nothing else, it's got a really bizarre analogy in it to try and explain the difference. So you might be asking, well, why do we need another show on lossy data encoding? And the answer is because of some tests that I've been doing recently that I found them interesting. I thought you guys would find them interesting as well. We'll come to that in a minute and also tell you how to do those tests yourself. But briefly, those acronyms that I was talking about, you have MP3, which is, I think, the oldest popular lossy data encoding algorithm. Oh, that's a real mouthful, isn't it?
One for music, yeah. JPEG is probably older than MP3s for lossy encoding, but other than that, you don't really think about, other than video or audio, video, and images, you don't really think about lossy encoding. Are PDFs lossless? I'm not even sure.
Well, PDFs contain images which can be JPEGs or they can be PNGs, which are lossless. So, and actually, I mean, you mentioned JPEGs, even older than the first kind of lossy data compression thing that I know about was a GIF. And the funny thing is that GIFs were used to be the only thing that you could use online because they only had 256 colors, so they were tiny. And then JPEGs came along and blew them out of the water, and now they've come back again and they're animated. So all of these codecs are data formats that do the same for audio as GIF and JPEGs do for images. I think MP3 is the oldest one that's been in popular use. It's a subset of the MPEG algorithm, and MPEG 2 is used on DVDs. But I think it's slightly more primitive than that. The 3 in it refers to layer 3 or something. It all gets very dull and I lose interest, to be honest. But AAC, which is what is used in iTunes by Apple, is more advanced than MP3s. You get better results at the same or lower data rates. And actually you get better results overall, in my opinion. And then you have OGG, which is used by Spotify, which I've never kind of done a real head-to-head comparison of these formats. And actually we'll see in a little while why that probably doesn't make much sense. But my personal preference has been for AAC, which is used by iTunes, rather than the streams that Spotify supplies. But that's probably not based on anything sensible. Do you have any instinct about that, John, or do you just not care?
I used to really care. I used to only use FLAC for a couple of years. I would rip my CDs as FLAC because then it's lossless. But it was MP3 before that, and I could hear some of the differences in some situations, or where it was just clearly bad. And now I just stream everything on Apple Music, and I don't care. It's the convenience. It's the not having to load a CD. It's all those things, like having my library or anything that I'm interested in hearing instantly on my phone or computer. That's better than everything. I don't care anymore. Too old.
I agree, although the tests that I'm going to start talking about in a second maybe have changed my mind ever so slightly. I mean, one thing that I will say is that the AAC files that you get from iTunes, I think, are 256 kilobits per second. And I think the premium stream on Spotify is 320 kilobits per second. Both of those are only throwing away roughly 2/3 of the original data.
Which seems like a lot. It really seems.
It seems like a lot, but those streams are twice the bandwidth of the kind of the 128 kilobits per second signals that we used to use back in the early days of MP3 and AAC. And at those kind of data rates, you really can do a pretty decent job of encoding the audio. So at that point, the kind of, comparing one format with another and worrying about these things probably gets even more moot. Can you be more moot than anyway? So yeah, I've mentioned these tests a few times, and these are the reason I thought it'd be fun to do another episode. So the first one that came up was I just did a YouTube video talking about Billie Eilish, who of course is huge news at the moment with her #1 album and a ton of excitement around her music and the fans and all the rest of it. And it was prompted by a debate on Facebook where people were saying the song Zanny in particular was insanely loud and damaged and distorted as a result, which, I've been there before, didn't particularly interest me, but I did get curious and took a listen, and sure enough, it has RMS levels on it that go right up to 0. So there is literally no difference between the peak and the RMS level at some points. But when I ran the song through the loudness penalty analyzer website to see what would happen to it online, what the streaming services would estimate its loudness at and how much they would turn it down, because people were saying this thing is just going to get turned way down. It's crazy. Why did they master it that way? What I found was that actually it doesn't get turned down a huge amount, and that the streaming services don't judge it to be super loud. And that kind of got me interested. So I ended up doing a video about it. And anybody who is interested to see that, we will put a link to it in the show notes at themasteringshow.com, and you can take a look. The reason I'm mentioning it here in this show is that I began to wonder whether part of the reason that people were reacting badly to the sound of it was not only the super loud sound and the processing that had been done to it, probably as part of the mix process, but also whether some of that was due to the fact that they were probably listening to it on Apple Music or YouTube or wherever, and it had been through a lossy data compression codec. And the way that I tested that was by doing some null tests, which I will describe in a minute. But if you own either, there's a Sonox encoding preview application, NewGen MasterCheck will let you preview MP3, AAC, and OGG, a variety of different streaming codecs in real time. Ozone 7, I think, Advanced introduced an encode checker so that you could preview AAC and MP3, and Wavelab has an encode checker. So all of these will enable you to experiment with what we're talking about in this episode for yourself in real time, which is a really interesting thing. And one of the most useful things is the ability to listen to the null signal, the difference signal. But before we talk about that, we should probably explain what a null test is. John.
Okay, so a null test is where you take two signals. One is known to be high quality, and the other one is where something has changed. And so a common one would be in a mixing situation. This is often where someone has sent two files and they don't have labels done right, and you import them and you don't know if they're supposed to be left and right signals, or if it's a duplicate of the same thing. And so you play both together and you polarity invert one of them, so the waves go down instead of up. opposite of the other original signal. And if you hear anything, that means that there is a difference. And it could be 0.001 difference in volume, or it could be EQ, or it could be dynamics processing, or any number of things. But if there's any sound coming out at all, then it means that there's a difference between the two files. It doesn't necessarily tell you which one has the difference in it, just that between those two files, there is a difference. If you want to do this on your own, you take two sounds that are similar, you polarity invert one of them, and then you're listening to just the difference between the two. So for example, I'll do that with our theme song. I'll take the original WAV file and then a very low quality MP3 file, and you'll hear the difference.
Exactly, because the MP3 encoding, all of these lossy encoding systems work by basically slicing the audio up into a lot of different frequency bands, maybe 30 or 60 different frequency bands, and then trying to decide which of those are the most important. They use this thing called perceptual coding, where they try and estimate which elements of the original sound are the most important to creating the sound that we hear, and which ones can be discarded without changing the sound too much. So when you do the null test, what you hear is everything that has been discarded.
Yeah.
And typically it kind of sounds a bit like something like that. And yeah, that was an excellent description of how this works, John. The only thing I would say for anybody trying to do this is you need to be careful that the two files that you're testing are perfectly time aligned.
Yeah, even a sample off can ruin it.
Exactly. Even a sample difference, you'll then hear something that isn't because there's a genuine difference between the two files. It's because you've got this little sample offset, because now the waves aren't perfectly cancelling out. And just to kind of make sure it's completely clear, if you have two files that are identical, to use John's example, say you have two files that are labeled differently and you're not sure if they're supposed to be the same or not, if you polarity invert one of them, flip the phase, is another way to say that, and play it back simultaneously to the original, and there's no signal at all, meaning the digital meters read absolutely nothing, then you can be sure that they're absolutely identical, and you can use whichever one you like. So it's a really powerful technique for investigating whether two things are the same or different. And you can get an idea, if you're careful, of the kind of thing you might be listening for. So just for example, if you listen to the null signal, the difference signal between the two files, and you just hear tiny little trebly, that kind of stuff, then you know that one of the files has slightly more or slightly less treble than the other, or potentially both. If you imagine an EQ curve where you've got a dip at 5K and a boost at 10K, the dip is on one version of the file and the boost is on the other. When you null test those two files against each other, you will hear both sets of differences. So you'll hear a bit of activity at 5K and 10K, but you've got no way of knowing which file that difference applied to. And that's the thing that you have to be careful with. Just because you've proved something is different doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or worse. However, in the case of testing lossy data encoding, we can be absolutely sure that the encoded file is not as good as the original, because by definition, the original has all of the information, the encoded file has less information, therefore it is inferior. Whether it's audibly inferior or not is another interesting question. So if you want to do the kind of thing that I did with the Billie Eilish video, where you're comparing the encoded version of a file with the original, you can use one of these tools, or you can do a testing code and line them up in your DAW and flick between them yourself. And it's a really interesting experiment. So the first thing I'm going to talk about that it reveals is you're actually fairly unlikely to be a problem. When a codec does the encoding, the filtering to split the audio signal up into all those discrete frequency bands and then analyze them, decide which ones to throw away, inevitably causes changes in the waveform. You put all of this heavy-duty filtering on, and most people know, if you've ever tried putting a low-cut filter, for example, on a piece of audio that was already peaking at 0, you will start to see peaks above 0. That's because the shape of the waveform has been changed because of the processing involved in the filter and the phase changes that it causes. It changes the peak level. That's not necessarily a problem when the file is encoded, because the encoded file, it's not strictly speaking floating point, as is used in our digital audio workstations, but it's, I guess, a slightly crude form of floating point, if you like. Certainly, it's possible to encode files that have peak levels above 0 and decode them safely without causing any clipping. But most decoders currently will clip the file immediately that it's decoded. So you decode the file in floating point, which retains the peak information, but then for convenience and processing speed and to avoid problems further down the line, many decoders will immediately clip the signal. Now, I don't have confirmation of this, but I'm pretty confident that iTunes is one of the few decoders that doesn't do that. But I'm also fairly confident that Spotify is one that does that. There are two reasons for that. One is the guidelines that they give on the website for supplying audio, which we'll come back to in a minute. And the other one is this test that I did. So I played back the Billie Eilish song in the video twice. I recorded it from Spotify once without normalization, so the song played at full volume. I had the volume control all the way up. Then I played it back again with normalization, which reduced the level by a few dBs because the song was a little bit louder than their reference level. Now, if all of that had happened without causing any clipping anywhere, you would expect those two versions of the song to null out completely, apart from maybe some very, very low-level hiss, because they would be identical. That's not what happened. What I actually got was clicky, gritty distortion in the null signal. So the music cancelled out completely, and you can hear these kind of spiky, unpleasant clipping distortion effects. So that tells us that somewhere in the system, Spotify is causing some clipping, and logically it has to be when the file is played back at full level. There's no reason that it would clip when it's been turned down by the normalization. So Spotify obviously is causing some kind of clipping at the decode if you don't have normalization enabled. That sounds like quite a nerdy point to make. Of course, normalization is the process of just turning down loud songs so that we don't get blasted by loud ones, and it comes enabled by default in Spotify. But ironically, it's exactly the kind of problem you're going to run into if you're a nerdy music fan, because some people are annoyed by normalization and say, I want to hear everything exactly as it was intended by the artist. So they disable the normalization feature in Spotify. The songs get played back at full level, and if they're controlling their monitoring gain at the amp instead of in the Spotify player, that song is going to get played back with extra clipping distortion that wasn't there in the original file before it was encoded. Okay, that was quite a long explanation. Did I get through it intact, John?
Okay, so someone decides to turn off normalization. A song is playing that is very loud, or it's prone to these sorts of intersample peaking because of decoding or lossy encoding. And when it's decoded through the streaming, it has clipping on it that wasn't in the original file, and it wasn't necessarily part of the encoding, but just the fact that it's decoded, not floating point. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think actually it probably is decoded floating point, but then they immediately reduce it to fixed bit depth. So I'm not sure whether that would be 16 or 24-bit. But yes, the decoder is taking the decoded signal and flattening it down to a fixed bit depth. And that causes clipping in some cases. So that's effect number one that people need to be aware of. And we've talked about that before, but I think it's worth bringing that up again. Yeah, sloppage room was your term for it, wasn't it?
Something like that, yeah. My analogy was if you have a coffee cup, you can't fill it up right to the top, like right to the edge of the cup, because you need room for cream and sugar. You need room for stirring it. You need room for it to wobble around as you're carrying it to your desk. So the same thing goes with mastering music. Leave a little bit of room. You can master it it could still be loud. It could still be, powerful, all these things. Leave 1 dB or so for encoding, for streaming playback, both for encoding it as a lossy format and for playing it back without adding clipping. And I don't think there's any difference on playback in terms of loudness, doing it that way, rather than having it clipped and sounding terrible, having artifacts in it and playing it back like that.
Absolutely.
It's gross.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the other point that I mentioned earlier is, on the one hand, you've got a test like this, which seems to show that this clipping can happen in Spotify if you have normalization disabled. Then you also have the guidelines that they released fairly recently, kind of suggesting best practices for uploading music to the system. And one of those recommendations is that you keep the peak levels exactly to -1 true peak or below. The really interesting thing is that they say that if your music is going to be louder, and they use the reference point of -14, but I think that's a fairly conservative estimate. But certainly, if the music is pushing up to kind of -12, -10 LUFS, then they recommend that you leave 2 dBs of peak headroom to make absolutely sure that none of this clipping on decode can happen. And again, I think that's pretty clear evidence that this is an issue with Spotify at the moment. And I can't name names, but I've been reliably informed that actually there are many other places in the industry where this kind of thing happens. And actually, there's one thing I can say, is that if you import an MP3 into Logic or Pro Tools, and I think a few other DAWs as well, those will reduce the file to fixed bit depth and bake in the clipping, if you like. So that's the first point. The second part of the experiment that you can do, the second bit of the null test, is to listen carefully to the encoding artifacts, to the kind of noises that you get. And that you can do with a null test, or if you have NewGen or Ozone, they both have a button in the interface that you can click to listen to the null test in real time. It won't reveal any clipping because all of their processing is done at floating point, but you can listen to the encoding artifacts. And that's a pretty ear-opening exercise in my experience, because most people, you listen to the original file, you listen to the encoded file, you think, yeah, that's pretty good. The fascinating thing, I think, is when you've listened to the null test for a while, then if you start flicking between the unencoded and the encoded stream, suddenly you start to be able to hear the artifacts much more clearly in the encoded stream. And we all know about the kind of the swirling electronic birdies of poor MP3 compression. That kind of the slightly metallic quality to the top end. And yeah, this kind of thing that happens. But the more modern codecs, especially AAC and OGG that are used by Spotify and Apple, are much less susceptible to those kind of blatant problems. And what you hear instead, well, the one that surprised me most was the extent to which the stereo width is reduced. So, anybody can do this test. You take an audio file, encode it with an audio format of your choosing, make it easy on yourself, go for a fairly low bit rate, like maybe 128 kilobits per second to start with. Then just line them up in a DAW and flick between them and listen to the stereo width. And this is the second example recently that kind of caught my attention and gave me the idea for this episode, is that I had just mastered a kind of an indie rock concept album, really, with ludicrous amounts of reverb. I mean, fantastically ludicrous. It was kind of these amazing kind of spacey, floaty vocals at certain points, and just this kind of cloud of space that kind of hung around. It was one of those things where the vocalist would sing a word and it would kind of hang there for seconds. It was like it had been performed in a cathedral or something. And you run that through 128 kilobit per second AAC or OGG stream, and you can just hear the image narrow as you go from one to the other. That kind of the outer phase stuff that kind of makes you feel like maybe sounds are coming from outside of the speakers. That just gets eaten alive by these codecs. And it makes sense. That's because most music, guitar, bass, drums, mono pan straight down the middle. That's the important stuff. That's what the codecs prioritize first. What I found is that if you step it down to a kind of a 96 kilobits per second stream, which is what typically is used on mobile devices, if you're listening to Apple Music or Spotify on the go on a phone, it's extreme. It's almost like they've hit a mono button. It doesn't literally happen with that. If you have an instrument that's clearly panned left or right, it will retain most of that information. But in terms of the reverb and the space around the sounds and all the rest of it, it just completely collapses into the center. It's a really fascinating test.
You lose a lot of the side signal, I think.
Exactly, yes. It's almost like you'd kind of converted to mid and side or sum and difference. And we did a show on this topic as well, which will melt your brains if you want to listen to it. We'll put the link in the show notes. It's almost like somebody has just kind of pulled down a fader in the sides, to be honest. So that's ear opening and is the first thing to listen to. But the other fascinating thing is it's a slightly tricky concept to talk about. So you have the original file, which is full quality, and then you encode it and you throw away 2/3 or 9/10 of the original information, and you end up with something that still sounds pretty much like the original file. But when you listen to the difference signal and kind of really tune into what it sounds like and then flick between those two, when you hear the encoded signal, it's basically like hearing the original signal plus the distortion of the difference signal. So to do this, you would have to set up an example, either using one of the encoder checkers or a homemade null test, so that you can hear the different signal, listen to it carefully, and then start flicking between the original signal and the encoded signal. And my experience is the encoded signal starts to sound like the original plus the distortion of the different signal, which seems to kind of fly against what I was saying earlier about you not being able to tell from a null test where the problem is. But it's actually literally true. Even though the different signal is the result of taking something away, the final result is like adding distortion to the original signal. And because we know which one is right, we can say with confidence that that's exactly what's happening. Running it through the encoder and decoding it is adding a substantial amount of distortion to the signal. And when you start to hear it that way, again, it's really enlightening to, I had not thought about it in that way until fairly recently. And maybe there are people listening going, well, duh, obviously. But I think it's an interesting way of testing these algorithms and trying to tune into what they're doing. And it really does change your perspective on whether a lossy encoded stream is good enough or not. Did that make any sense?
It's a bit confusing. I get it, but it is a bit confusing.
It's really hard to do without drawing pictures.
The distortion that's added is there because things are taken away.
Correct.
I don't know, like using a Photoshop tool to remove the background, and you get the little fuzzy things, or like around the hair and things like that, where you can't make a selection correctly, that sort of thing.
Actually, that's a great example. Yes, the slightly jagged edges that you get around things. So yeah, you've taken something away from the image and you've introduced distortion to what's left.
Yeah.
Great way of putting it. I should have said that.
It's like if you have a grayscale with 1,000 values between black and white, and you replace it with a grayscale that's 50 levels between white and black, but the foreground is still the same in front of it, you're going to notice something.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually we could go back to, if we think about JPEG encoding, because everybody knows about those kind of the funny little ripply edges that you get around the edges of sharp edges in a JPEG.
When you save a copy of a copy of a copy.
Especially when you do that, yeah. So you're adding distortion to the image and you end up with something that looks like the final result, but it's just adding distortion. And that's what's happening to the audio. You start off with the lossy stuff and it's adding all this kind of mulchy, swirly stuff and crushing up the stereo image and possibly adding clipping distortion, all the rest of it. It's just adding distortion into the signal.
I'm going to go slightly off topic, but that reminds me of a lot of the AI produced images that I've seen. And there's always that sort of like really nasty, like blurry, sort of distorted part to the image. And I always wonder if that is what the machine learned from. And so it produces that because, probably feed it a whole bunch of images that are probably JPEGs and probably lossy and have all these little artifacts in them. And then does it produce something with those artifacts, or is it just because we see the result as a low quality JPEG that it looks like that?
Or is it the result, the inevitable conclusion of kind of combining the different aspects, if it's got a sort of a blob of one image and a blob of another and it's building them together? That's interesting. I have no idea. There's probably somebody at Google who could tell us the answer to that.
I love those sort of things where you can, you draw a happy face and it fills it in with sort of like a painting or even photorealistic version of that face, but it's horrifying because it's AI generated, and it's just like, taking thousands of images and putting them together into a thing that resembles what you drew. It's horrifying. I hate it, but I love it. It's so disgusting to look at.
I think we're going to have to edit this. I think we're going to have to edit this out because I think you've just invented the next $1 million plugin. Imagine having a plugin that would do that for audio. You give give the plugin an AI, you play it a ton of, or it's just pulls in a load of audio off of the internet. Then you feed it a sound and it goes, oh, that sounds a little bit like this, so I'm going to do this to it. That would be a serious DSP mangling thing.
Yeah, that'd be nuts. I can't even imagine what it would look like or sound like. I mean,
I can't, but I'd like to try.
I've got some pretty nasty stuff for mangling audio.
Yeah, but it's somehow nicer one of the nice things about the AI images is that you're not in control of them, isn't it? It's like, it's just this kind of wild, it's like some insane genius sort of splattering photographs at a canvas.
I saw something yesterday. It was like a webcam of a person's face, and as they move their mouth and stuff, an AI generated image of buildings is produced that matches the facial expressions.
Oh, you're going to have to link me up with that. And we're probably going to have to put it in the show notes. I saw one, I don't have a link for this, but I'm pretty sure it was, it just put kind of little sharp faces of animals with sharp teeth all over things. It's kind of whenever it saw, kind of slightly triangular shapes in the original image. So you'd have a picture of a person and they would just have all these little animal heads with biting, or maybe that was a nightmare I had. Anyway.
The Google DeepMind things are often like that.
Yeah.
Very psychedelic, weird stuff.
I now want to hear the audio equivalent quite badly. Okay, so all of this is deeply confusing and possibly not coming across via speech on a podcast. The good news is that that's okay, because actually it's pretty easy to avoid all of this stuff. And if you've been paying attention, you'll already know what the rules are. A couple of people kind of commented on this in-depth analysis that I did of the Billie Eilish song, and I felt in the comments that I had to explain that that's not what I do when I'm mastering. It's a useful way of explaining to somebody what's happening and to demonstrating to them why things might sound the way that they sound. But we don't have to do null tests, and we shouldn't be doing null tests whilst mastering. And I don't think we should be listening to things through lossy encoders either, because there's a kind of a worldview that says that maybe we should be optimizing audio to survive these codecs better. So if you have a codec that is pulling out the stereo space in your image, maybe you should add extra stereo width going in to compensate for that. There's a certain amount of logic to that, and I think if a client particularly requested it, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't do that. But the reality is, we don't know what's going to happen to our audio when it gets out there in the world. We don't know what data rate it's going to be compressed at. So do you optimize the stereo width for 128 kilobits per second, or for 256 kilobits per second, or for 96 kilobits per second? there's also, I haven't had a chance to look into this, but somebody emailed me just recently commenting that they had two versions of the same song and they'd used different limiters to try and achieve the final loudness. And they preferred one of them, but when they put the signal through an encoding checker to see how the encoded streams would sound, they changed their opinion. Their opinion about which one sounded better swapped when listening to the encoded versions. What do you do in that situation? Do you optimize for, well, my answer is always that you optimize for the lossless version. That's the master. All of these lossy data encoded versions are just byproducts. And I think they're temporary. They'll be around for another 5, maybe 10 years, and then everything will be lossless and there'll be nothing but a distant memory. Thank goodness. But so, yeah, personally, I don't think optimizing for these codecs makes much sense, but I do think it's good to be aware of them and to understand how they work, if only so that we can talk to our clients sensibly about them. If you want to avoid these problems yourself, John already mentioned rule number 1, which is to keep your true peak levels to -1 or less. That's not a guarantee, but it is a good rule of thumb. The true peak level gives you some idea of what might happen after encoding, and the -1 gives you a little bit of extra sloppage room for lower data rates. The other thing to do is to keep your overall loudness within sane limits. The harder you push the overall loudness of the signal up against the limiter or the clipper or whatever it is that you're processing you're using to control the peak level, the denser the audio signal gets and the harder it is for the encoder to do a good job. As always, you don't want to be too dynamic. That's almost as bad as being not dynamic enough. But finding that perfect balance that we've talked about many times in the show, luckily, all of these codecs were designed by testing them on real music. So they have been optimized to make real music sound great. And a lot of the testing and optimization went on in the early 90s when the loudness wars had not hit the levels that they did around the year 2000. So if you have your dynamics balanced and in the sweet spot, there's a good chance the codec is going to be able to do a great job of encoding it and you're going to get great results. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so. Moderate loudness, peaks no higher than -1 true peak.
There you go. Nice and simple. Nice and easy.
Do you think that Billie Eilish song actually was too dynamic in the, between the verse and the chorus?
Well, it's interesting. That's a really good question.
It's a very interesting effect. On studio monitors, that effect when it comes into the chorus, I guess I would call it, is like 3D. And it's extremely uncomfortable, but very cool at the same time. It's like when if you've ever been in a car with just massive subs and like everything's just blown out because of the amount of bass, it's that, but at any level. That I don't think I've heard that in kind of like a studio recording. I've only heard that on playback where it sounds like, too much bass or, it sounds weird, but I don't know.
Well, so there's two different questions there, right? You said, do I think the dynamic contrast between the verse and the chorus is too much? So I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to it in a second. And then there's the effect you're talking about. I mean, there's actually a ton of processing happening in the in Zanny when the bass comes in. So the voice has some kind of, it's almost like an autopan effect. It kind of flutters from side to side in the stereo image. Mm-hmm. And there's some clipping distortion in there on the bass and the voice. And it's kind of timed, you're exactly right, so that it feels as though it's the bass that's blowing the thing out.
It's like an amplitude modulator, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I have heard that kind of, well, not so much the amplitude modulation, but I have heard that kind of the clipping, the kind of blowing out effect, but usually in much more aggressive genres or in stuff where the loudness has been pushed to insane levels. But spoiler alert for the video, actually the loudness of this, I don't think is insane. It is really loud, and it's probably a couple of dBs louder than I would have chosen to master it, but everybody knows that I'm an extremist. It would be perfectly possible to do a clean master of that track at that loudness, if that was the goal. And the fascinating thing is that after releasing the video, a few people got in touch with me and said, oh, hey, here are some interviews with Phineas, who is Billy's brother, who co-wrote and recorded and engineered the album with her. And he has been quoted as saying, all of this is deliberate. It's very carefully constructed, which,
I think you can tell. I think you can tell. That,
exactly.
Because everything else is like really, really cleanly recorded, like nice sounding. It's got like a interesting vibe. Like you can tell that they're really talented and they're very meticulous about how they do things. But it's just so different. And I'm kind of surprised that this, that this sort of almost experimental music is as big as it is right now.
Well, I think that's what's cool about it. As I was going to say, I have heard it in some other genres, but to hear it in kind of what is effectively mainstream pop, I think is really cool and fits in really well with just what they're doing, because it's pop with a twisted edge to it, and so, yeah, so that's part one. I think there's definitely, that's creative decisions happening there. Rather than, as the original debate on Facebook was going, poor mastering.
I think I could pull it back a couple dB.
Exactly.
It would still be very effective.
Yeah, there are other loud moments on the album where I'm just thinking, actually, this is I think it would have sounded just as good, and maybe it would have sounded nicer. You could never tell because we haven't heard the original source, but that's just my instinct. But the other question you asked was whether there's too much contrast between the verse and the chorus. And I mean, in Zanny, it's extreme. The verse is down at -16, I think, LUFS, and then the chorus is up at -9 or -8 or something. So that's a big difference. And actually, funnily enough, I was listening to it in the car with my son this afternoon, and with the road noise and with the volume turned so that it didn't actually cause the speakers in the car to flip out because there was so much bass. When it gets to the really quiet stuff, you virtually couldn't hear her. Now, it kind of didn't matter because you knew that it was there and that's the effect that they're going for. But again, I wonder whether maybe if they had just moderated that slightly, there'd been a little less contrast, it would have had the same emotional effect, but worked even better.
She's singing so quietly, you kind of like lean into it, and I never really pay attention to pop music, but your video on it caught my attention, and I had to go and look into it, and I find her brother very interesting. So yeah, like everything about it is so out there, kind of, but it's really effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, the interesting thing I think is all of the things that we've been talking. I would say actually that album is kind of the exception to the rule. There are albums where you just think if that had been mastered more conservatively, it would just have sounded so much better. And in this case, I think they got away with it, which is great because I love the album. And there's nothing I hate more than an album I love musically deeply upsetting me for sonic reasons. Seriously irritating. So yeah, it's a really interesting example. And if anybody is curious, then head over, take a look at the YouTube video and see what you think as well. So there we go. I think we've well and truly done that topic to death. John, thank you for explaining the null test to us and mixing the episode as always.
Yep. I will null test the rest of this episode before you guys hear it.
Excellent. If you like this episode, please head over to iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts and give us a rating or a review. We really appreciate it. Tell your friends and head over to themasteringshow.com where you can sign up to the email list to be notified of new episodes as soon as they come out and get all of the show notes delivered directly to your inbox. Thanks to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music for the show, and thanks for listening.